Hey there folks, the #1 Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds record, Wild God. It can feel nearly obvious to a painful extent to refer to Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds' overall discography as a band as consistent. I mean, even those that disparage the band or harbor some sort of dislike for them will probably still admit that they've been putting out a steady stream of well-loved records for over 40 years at this point. It has been a full 4 decades since their first full-length studio album, and whether you love their early, raw, gothic punk influence sounds on records like their first full-length studio LP, 1984's From Her to Eternity, a record that managed to take a lot of the grim energy of Cave's prior band, The Birthday Party, the tender singer-songwriter tendencies of records like 1997's The Boatman's Call, or something more tonally somber in the later years of the band, like their most recent effort besides Wild God, 2019's Ghosteen. There's pretty much no denying that everything they've done has been acclaimed to some extent, at least. The reception that the Bad Seeds have received over time has never really dipped into the negative at any point. I mean, sure, there are the fan-favorite records, and you could argue that back in 2003, Nocturama resulted in the most polarizing album that the Bad Seeds ever put out, an album that people still debate about the quality of to this very day, but nonetheless, Wild God, the band's latest studio album, sees them continue that streak of consistency, unsurprisingly, while also tackling a new creative direction that feels like the culmination of sounds that they've been building up for several records in a row at this point. So, to provide context, 2013's Push the Sky Away marked a new era for Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds that was significantly more enigmatic and stylistically sparse than anything they had done in recent memory up to that point, rather than indulging in some of the more grimy garage rock tendencies of the ever underrated and then somewhat recent Dig Lazarus Dig. Emphasis was placed on a minimalistic atmosphere, and this new direction was emphasized on following records, most notably 2016's highly beloved Skeleton Tree and the aforementioned Ghosteen as well, with the latter arguably being the most ambience-focused Nick Cave record period to date. Wild God manages to feel like a continuation of that sound, but at the same time, it never in any sense is a repetition of anything that listeners may have heard in the past from the Bad Seeds' recent material. Rather, it manages to feel like an entirely new and unique entity that is picking up on some of these same ideas and concepts that have been brought to light in recent years via the Bad Seeds' more modern material. One could even go as far as to say that Wild God feels like a final chapter of this particular era of Cave's career. I mean, much of his more recent work has been marred with tragedy of various forms, most noticeably the awful, tragic passing of his 2 sons, and whereas his most recent work has reflected the emotional devastation that suits such a life-altering string of events, Wild God comes across as a significantly more hopeful record, not necessarily a record that is blinded to the overall tragedy of life or anything of that sort, but nonetheless an album that tends to look towards the future with a brighter sort of outlook than anything that you would have expected on a record like Skeleton Tree or Ghosteen. I mean, it should be said that there still is a lingering feeling of weariness throughout this record that inherently comes with the life experiences that Cave has publicly faced in recent years that have influenced his music greatly, but at the same time there's a notable brightness about the tones found throughout this record that has not been seen in his work in quite some time. The staunch mournfulness woven into his modern work is replaced here with life-affirming moments on tracks like the single Frogs, for example. I mean, this is a collection of songs that feels willing to recognize the sorrow it has faced in the past, but is also willing to welcome the warmth of the future with open arms if it is to come. A sizable portion of this change could be attributed to some of the fresh gospel influences that the Bad Seeds take up throughout Wild God, and hearing his comrades and Cave himself go through this stylistic change is nothing new whatsoever. It's completely expected from Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds at this point to go 2-3 albums before taking an entirely new creative direction. That has been a consistent theme throughout their entire discography over the course of the past 40 years. It just feels unlikely that anyone will be truly shocked that Wild God comes across as an entirely unique entry in the overall Bad Seeds discography, yet to that same extent, much of these gospel sounds are what define this record as not only something unique in this album, but as something that feels very definitive in terms of coming across as a late career Nick Cave record. Much of these gospel sounds can be found in some of the most grand moments on the track list, such as the uplifting conversion, or the brief album closer As the Water Covers the Sea, which especially highlights these notes of gospel with some stunning backing vocals, while it also drives home a deeper purpose of these newfound influences. I mean, between the manner in which the record uplifts the listener and Cave alike, and how it hones in on creating a more at-peace tone for the modern lineup of the Bad Seeds after several records going through a series of mournings, the gospel tone taken up on this record provides a very fitting form of creative closure for a period of Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds that was forcibly structured around unforeseen tragedies. The gospel influences create this tone of hope and holiness and faith in the world and humanity in existence that feels entirely unique from anything that the Bad Seeds have put out in recent times, and it can't even really be compared to the last record that Cave himself was involved with of note, Carnage, several years ago at this point, back in 2021, a solo project that he pursued with Warren Ellis. Even that record did not really feel nearly as hopeful and longing for the future as this record here does, and a lot of those gospel influences are really what do drive that home. Some of the electronic influences peppered about the album are nice as well, although they feel significantly more rare than the gospel roots of much of the track list. Perhaps the most notable example of that is on the track Final Rescue Attempt, with some very light synthy sounds that, at least to an extent, harken back to the early 2010s Bad Seeds, with the subtle electronic influences of tracks like We Know Who You Are from the previously mentioned Push the Sky Away album. And while these sounds may have been significantly more subtle here than they have been on certain past releases from the group, it is nonetheless very nice to see the record tie itself in with some of the more recent material that the Bad Seeds have been putting out, while also in turn allowing itself to feel like an evolution of a much larger series of records that have been going on for over a decade at this point. It should also be said that Cave's vocal work, especially on the more ballad-oriented tracks like Long Dark Night, are particularly great, as one would expect from a man who is considered a Sinatra-esque crooner of the Gothic and has been for multiple decades at this point, though really it is his songwriting throughout Wild God that could be given similar credits in regards to creating one of the Bad Seeds' most profoundly touching records in years, with the topics of joy and love being recurring themes throughout the entire record, with the notion of persevering through suffering to find love within the human experience once again being a centerpiece for many of the tracks here, and a centerpiece that draws in a huge amount of passion from Cave and company on this record. It comes as no surprise that Cave brings his usual high standards of heartfelt songwriting to the table here. It's an expected quality of the Bad Seeds at this point, and again, even if you do expect it, it's nonetheless ever impressive to hear him in full beautiful action as a songwriter once again. For example, the track Joy stands out as a more forward cut that tackles the titular feeling of lines like, "Yet the stars stand above the earth, bright triumphant metaphors of love," conveying ideas of rediscovering beauty in the universe in a successful attempt at that, to create one of the most emotionally vulnerable yet uplifting records that we've gotten from the Bad Seeds in a very, very long time. Meanwhile, you have songs like Cinnamon Horses and Frogs that try to successfully convey similar or even the same ideas in a more cryptic yet equally well-penned and poetic manner, while tracks like Oh Wow, How Wonderful She Is utilize the concept of faith, with the aforementioned track in particular paying tribute to the late great Anita Lane, a former Bad Seeds member and Cave collaborator who tragically passed away years ago in 2021, and also whose 1993 solo album Dirty Pearl is horribly underrated. If you like that kind of more dramatic gothic side of Nick Cave around that period, I would highly recommend that record in particular. particular. All of this is to say that Cave's work as a songwriter has always been one of the strongest points of any project that he is involved in, whether it's the Bad Seeds, whether it's Grinder Man, whether it's his solo work, hell, whether it's the Birthday Party or the Boys Next Door. Anything that he is involved in, the songwriting that he provides is usually a major highlight, and the Bad Seeds have never been an exception, and Wild God is certainly not an exception either. But more than that, it feels nothing short of touching to hear him writing so tenderly about his faith and about his own reflections on his existence at a point in his career where his meditations on humanity and its various corners of nature feel more thoughtful, feel more profound, and feel more, above all else, deeply personable than ever before. Wild God is an album that would be a career-defining masterpiece for an artist lesser than Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, and it is in turn a massive testament to their quality of their overall body of work that this record doesn't even crack their top 5 in a discography that has records like Henry's Dream, Let Love In, Murder Ballads, among various others. I would even argue that there's some work that they put out in the 2000s that manages to achieve similar levels of emotional striking qualities. No More Shall We Part in particular stands out as a massively striking record, and this is just to say that Wild God is such an amazing record that it is impressive on the Bad Seeds' part that it doesn't even rank among my personal favorites, because this is still one of my favorite albums of 2024 so far. Being another stunning record in a sea of near-perfect albums from the same band, it certainly doesn't make Wild God a lesser release by any means. Hearing the Bad Seeds put out a record that feels as authentic as Wild God is not rare either, but it is beyond pleasant to hear them do so in a much more uplifting and, dare I say, downright hopeful context compared to the extreme tragedy that has brought life to much of Cave and Company's recent work. Everything about this album marks the end of yet another era for one of the greatest bands to ever walk this earth, and it does so in such a stunning way by providing a bright look into the future after the somber nature of the past records and the themes that have been inherently woven into them. This is just a really stunning record, a era-defining record for Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, and more than that, it's just a beautifully sentimental and emotional record that manages to convey everything that it tries to get across in a beautiful manner, in a deeply poetic manner, fantastic compositions, fantastic backing vocals with the gospel influences being implemented here, and as a whole, one cannot see this record and help but look towards the future, knowing that Wild God is a truly perfect closing statement for Cave and the rest of the Bad Seeds' decade-long wrestling match with the fragility of human existence. I am going to give this record 4.5 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. Thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I will see you in the next one.